I'm Matthew Redmond, and this is About the Author. If you're listening to this podcast, I have something to tell you, and it might make you feel bad. I think you forgot someone's birthday, and it was a big one, and frankly, you missed it by a lot. The someone I'm talking about is the poet, philosopher, and theologian Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who turned 252 in October. I think we can all agree, at that age, every year is cause for celebration. Now, you may say, listen, Matthew, I don't even know Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Well, I hope to rectify that problem over the next 20 minutes or so. And anyway, it's simply no excuse. Coleridge is a big deal. I would even say a huge deal. And besides, his birthday parties can get pretty interesting. I remember when he turned the big 250 back in 2022. You should have been there. A bunch of his admirers gathered beside his grave at St. Michael's Church in Highgate and recited one of his best-loved poems, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, first published in 1798. It's a poem about a man who, on the way to a wedding celebration, crosses paths with a mysterious old sailor who shares with him the story of a treacherous and unforgettable sea voyage that he alone barely survived. That poem, which I encourage everyone to read, several times if convenient, is absolutely filled with brilliant lines, like the ones that describe the old mariner himself and his mission in life. Let me read those lines for you now. Forthwith, this frame of mine was wrenched with a woeful agony, which forced me to begin my tale, and then it left me free. Since then, at an uncertain hour, that agony returns, and till my ghastly tale is told, this heart within me burns. I pass like night from land to land, I have strange power of speech. That moment that his face I see, I know the man that must hear me. To him my tale I teach. You may be wondering what exactly happens on this sea voyage that the mariner is talking about. Well, to make a long ballad short, everything is going fine until the mariner kills an albatross with his crossbow, which brings a curse down upon the entire vessel and its crew. The mariner travels all the way to the South Pole, only to watch his fellow crewmen killed by the incarnation of death itself. Devastated by this loss, he learns a deeper love for all of God's creatures, even the slimy sea monsters circling his ship, and returns to land with the help of the possessed corpses of the sailors. Then he becomes a storyteller, sharing what happened with a select few who are worthy to hear it, like our nameless wedding guest. The ancient mariner is also an ancient artist. In the world of this poem, then, art is a process of translating into speech things gone unspeakably awry. According to the mariner, the moral of his story is, quote, "He prayeth well who loveth well, both man and bird and beast." But that moral seems overshadowed by an atmosphere of disaster that clings to him ever after and gives him the power to enthrall unwilling listeners. It's his failure, more than his wisdom, that fascinates others. The man who wrote this amazing poem should be easy to admire, and not just for this poem. After all, Samuel Taylor Coleridge is as important an intellectual as England has ever produced. Together with his friend William Wordsworth, he revolutionized the craft of poetry in English. Instead of writing like people did in the 18th century, producing poems as cold and distant as marble statues, Coleridge gave us poetry with blood and sinews and the power to feel intensely. As a theologian, he composed tracts that influenced the rise of what we call Broad Church Anglicanism. In philosophy, he planted the seeds of transcendentalism and used his genius for synthesis, or as he put it, making extremes meet, to direct the course of metaphysics after Immanuel Kant. No short list of the greatest literary critics in English history is short enough to omit his name. If you love Shakespeare, or if you've ever used the term suspension of disbelief, you owe Coleridge at least a little thanks. and every surviving record paints him as the conversationalist and lecturer of his age, a figure of the most surpassing eloquence and active intellect, nothing less than a modern-day oracle. Not bad, right? But even with that unbelievable resume, people who admire Coleridge have always somewhat pitied him as well. To generations of readers, he has been the patron saint of unrealized potential, the prince of failures. Not until Orson Welles came along, I think, would another artist generate so much work of global historical significance while somehow, against all odds, making his name synonymous with disaster. At least some of the time, Coleridge clearly saw himself as a spectacular disappointment, and people who knew him well were always struck by the gulf between his dazzling best-laid plans and his fragmented output. He himself seemed fragmented, his frail form slowly breaking apart under the strain of so much intelligence, rivaled only by debilitating self-doubt. How is all this possible? How do you snatch failure from the jaws of success the way Coleridge apparently did? Are we in fact remembering him wrong? And what exactly did failure mean to Coleridge himself, anyway? Let's spend the rest of this episode seeking answers to these questions in Coleridge's own life and works. And if we fail, at least we'll be in good company. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was born on October 21st, 1772, in the rural county of Devon, the 10th and final child of a respected vicar and a woman whose background remains obscure. He was the kind of child who chose books over outdoor games every time, and as a result, he had Robinson Crusoe and other classics under his belt by the age of 6. He attended Christ's Hospital, a boarding school south of Horsham, with other boys who would go on to change the course of English literature. One of these was Charles Lamb, who wrote an essay 35 years later in which he remembered Coleridge as a kind of warship that, quote, could turn with all tides, tack about, and take advantage of all winds by the quickness of his wit and invention, end quote. Built for success, in other words, made to travel fast and far, not to get swallowed up in a whirlpool within sight of land, as the ancient mariner's ship does. From Christ's Hospital, Coleridge moved on to Cambridge, but he found very little there to challenge his impressive intellect, and finally he left without a degree. What he did have by that time was a plan to improve all humankind. Inspired by the French Revolution, or at least parts of it, Coleridge and his good friend Robert Southey wanted to establish a more perfect community in America that would be governed according to what Coleridge called pantisocracy, which means equal rule by all. Wouldn't you know it, an American real estate man came along right around that time and convinced Coleridge to establish his new community in Pennsylvania, along the Susquehanna River. Coleridge liked the idea, and so 12 of his fellow radicals were dispatched to the site. Coleridge was serious about this project, so serious that around this time he even got engaged to Southey's fiancée's sister, Sarah, apparently because he felt it was incumbent on the founder of this new community to be fruitful and multiply. The land project, as you've probably already guessed, fell through. The engagement, despite Coleridge's deep reservations, did not. In this first great folly, we can pretty clearly discern at least some of the ruling principles of Coleridge's life: a strong attraction to impossible projects, a desire to change the world, and an extreme vulnerability to guilt. To be quite honest with you, I don't think that a dreamy bookworm like Coleridge would have served very well as the founder of a new society, and I seriously doubt whether his ambition in this line was much more than regular teenage rebellion amplified by genius. But anyway, with his plan in ruins, the young man would divert much of his attention from altering the structure of people's lives to the arrangement of their language and their souls. In 1795, Coleridge met William Wordsworth. I like saying those words because they represent a sea change in world literature. Here are two of the most important creative minds in history, and yet neither one could have invented the other. They were almost too different for words, although critics have used all the words, trying to explain what that difference consists of precisely. Wordsworth, like John Milton, had the kind of genius that absorbs everything and stamps it with his own likeness. In his world, even nothingness itself looks like William Wordsworth. Coleridge's mind, I think, was more like Shakespeare's, constantly being absorbed by everything, and by language most of all. Which would you rather be? I'm not sure how to answer that question myself. I only know that getting swept up in every whirlpool and rolling tide that you come across is a very perilous way to live, as Coleridge's example clearly shows. I also know that, unlike most of the other British Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Blake, Shelley, Byron, etc., Coleridge sorely lacked for confidence. You would have needed a microscope to find his ego. But if Coleridge's neurosis has been called an impediment to his writing, I would argue it gives his poems a kind of embattled humanity that his literary peers could not access. Sometimes the specter of failure is almost his friend, and the number one example of this is a poem of his called Kubla Khan. The poem has a preface in which Coleridge explains that he recently retired to a farmhouse near Porlock to recover from a bout of ill health. There he took laudanum, which is opium dissolved in alcohol, once prescribed medicinally, and fell asleep for about 3 hours, composing between 200 and 300 lines of a new poem in his dreams. Of course, he woke up wanting to write it down, but then, as he explains in the third person, disaster struck. I'll read his explanation for you here. On awaking, he appeared to himself to have a distinct recollection of the whole, and taking his pen, ink, and paper, instantly and eagerly wrote down the lines that are here preserved. At this moment he was unfortunately called out by a person on business from Porlock, and detained by him above an hour, and on his return to his room found, to his no small surprise and mortification, that though he still retained some vague and dim recollection of the general purport of the vision, yet, with the exception of some 8 or 10 scattered lines and images, all the rest had passed away like the images on the surface of a stream into which a stone has been cast, but, alas, without the after restoration of the latter. So, just to be clear, Coleridge was all set to finish one of the most brilliant and revolutionary poems in the English language when some random visitor from Porlock came along, knocked on the door, and broke his concentration, causing him to forget most of it. Wow, missed it by that much. Generations of readers mesmerized by Coleridge's poem have cursed this uninvited person from Porlock for spoiling it. But the truth is, this man probably never existed, except in Coleridge's head, as his own symbol of all the worldly things, like friends, that constrain our otherworldly ambitions. Much like Caliban in Shakespeare's The Tempest, the speaker of Kubla Khan awakes to a desperate yearning for more dreams and would take his waking slower if he could. For Coleridge, the vision of another world does not resolve, but rather dissolves, in the clamor of a knock at the door, the bustle of busy companies of men, the pressures of an imminently industrializing society. Nothing born of this increasingly crowded and grubby world of ours can fully contain the bliss that lies beyond it. So here's a question. Why would you publish an unfinished poem? And if it's really a finished poem in some sense, why would you pretend otherwise? The answer, I think, has to do with what it really means to fail. Kubla Khan tells us that failure, far from putting a damper on Coleridge's most visionary projects, is what makes them visionary in the first place. When you're striving for something unattainable, like heaven on earth, any outcome besides failure is just delusion, and nothing strengthens one's belief in the existence of paradise like the agony of having just missed it. Nothing succeeds like failure. Seen in this light, Coleridge's many failures and fragments seem more noble and authentic than any alternative that even he could have dreamt up. But here's what else I think we should remember about failure. No matter how noble or aspirational, it still hurts. It definitely hurt Coleridge. It hurt his relationships, his finances, his sanity. His desire to make good as an artist and intellectual was anything but ironic. He wanted to stand shoulder to shoulder with the best and most prolific thinkers of his or any era. And the more he labored and thrashed to escape his growing reputation as unreliable, uncommitted, or both, the more deeply he sank into ruin. It was a quicksand life. By the turn of the century, Coleridge's friends thought he had sunk as far as one possibly could. Laudanum wasn't just a literary device for him. He had been taking it for years to relieve ailments from childhood, and from around 1801, as rheumatism crept over him, his dependence on the drug grew more intense. An 1806 trip to Malta, intended to help him get clean, only made things worse. Eventually, his addiction cost him Wordsworth's friendship, estranged him from his wife, and, as his poetry shows, ravaged his peace of mind. Around the time that Wordsworth and Coleridge were drifting apart, Wordsworth wrote a new preface to the book of poems that he and Coleridge had once published together, called Lyrical Ballads. In that preface, Wordsworth ignored Coleridge's contributions to the book and described at length his own theory of language and poetry. Coleridge, stunned by this insult and convinced that Wordsworth's theory was full of holes, started writing what was supposed to be a short preface of his own to defend himself. It was under these circumstances that Coleridge started writing his longest prose work, called the Biographia Literaria, which defines his career and legacy like no other single text. The Biographia is a truly odd piece of writing that defies all categorization. When it stopped being just an exercise in damage control, Coleridge thought it had morphed into an autobiography. Once it had transcended that genre, he set the pattern for generations of critics by not being sure what it was. Over the course of 24 chapters, he shares intimate remembrances of things past, converses with philosophers from Aristotle to Kant, expounds his own theory of the poetic imagination, and throws considerable shade at Wordsworth's. He also promises in Chapter 2 to write a real autobiography someday, which, of course, he never did. Upon its release, the Biographia polarized critics, who couldn't decide amongst themselves whether it was a methodical masterpiece or a big old pile of loose rags. That debate became more complex when Coleridge's friend, Thomas de Quincey, demonstrated that large swaths of the Biographia had been stolen without attribution from the writings of German critic Karl Wilhelm Friedrich Schlegel. Other thefts from Germanic sources were exposed afterward. Late 20th century critics litigated this matter to death, using scraps of evidence to construct Coleridge's process and assign different proportions of leisure and haste to the writing of each chapter, all in an effort to establish whether Coleridge was lifting passages from the Germans in a frenzied and careless state, not fully realizing what he did, or whether it was a kind of premeditated theft, the work of a man who simply didn't care about intellectual integrity. Perhaps these questions seem less important to us now. Zooming out, we see that the central problem of the Biographia Literaria is also the problem of Coleridge's entire career: how to interpret a vast, shifting patchwork of triumphs, fragments, stolen snippets, and unrealized plans. What are we looking at here? What larger pattern, if any, emerges from such unwieldy efforts in so many different directions? If Coleridge knew the answer to that question, he was not forthcoming with it. In 1816, he withdrew to the Highgate home of physician James Gilman, from which he seldom stirred thereafter. Thomas Carlyle, in his book Life of John Sterling, tells us that Coleridge, quote, sat on the brow of Highgate Hill in those years, looking down on London and its smoke tumult, like a sage escaped from the inanity of life's battle. The practical intellects of the world did not much heed him, or carelessly reckoned him a metaphysical dreamer. But to the rising spirits of the young generation, he had this dusky, sublime character, and sat there as a kind of magus, girt in mystery and enigma. Among those rising spirits was Mary Shelley, the future author of Frankenstein. Legend has it that Shelley, at 8 years old, and still 11 years from giving life to Victor Frankenstein and his creature, hid behind the sofa in her father's parlor and listened to Coleridge recite The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a poem that Victor quotes in the novel. Figuratively speaking, it may be that Coleridge's silent, icy ocean in Mariner is the same vista where Frankenstein, another tale of haunting isolation, begins. Coleridge died at Highgate in 1834. Was he a cursed artist? Here's the way I see it. Sometimes defiantly, sometimes of necessity, he rode successive crests of disaster through life, stepping from the prow of each scuppered project to the stern of the next, and from the last of these often magnificent wrecks into a kind of immortality that rests not much less on his generational intellect than on any of its fruits. Like the ancient mariner, Coleridge was not made to drown where so many others had done. Not every captain goes down with the ship. Thank you for your kind attention, and please consider subscribing if you're so inclined. This has been About the Author, a podcast made possible through the generous support of the European Commission and listeners like you.